It was a quiet morning in the small town of Dry Creek, tucked away in the hills of Southern California. The sun had just begun its climb over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the sparse landscape. At the foot of a lonely hill, a jogger stumbled upon a sight that would forever change the town's tranquil reputation. The body of a 17-year-old boy lay partially covered by a blanket of dirt and leaves, his face bruised and swollen, with dried blood crusted around his nose and mouth. His clothes were tattered, as if he had been dragged through the harsh terrain. The boy, later identified as Luke Thompson, was well known in the community. He was a quiet, obedient member of the local religious group, the Shepherd's Way, a congregation that had existed for decades under the strict leadership of Pastor Samuel Doyle. Pastor Doyle had become a figure of respect, his sermons filled with fire and brimstone, warning of the dangers of straying from the path of righteousness. His followers, including Luke, were fiercely loyal. Detective Mark Hartman, a seasoned investigator, was called to the scene. He had seen death many times, but something about the scene unsettled him. Luke's death wasn't natural, it was violent, intentional. The pastor and members of the Shepherd's Way claimed Luke had recently chosen to leave the flock and live a life of sin, but Hartman doubted this story from the start. There was something odd about the way they spoke of him, as if his decision to leave wasn't entirely his own. As he surveyed the scene, Hartman noticed bruises on Luke's wrists and ankles, marks that suggested he had been restrained. This was no simple runaway case, and Hartman had a gut feeling that the key to understanding this tragedy lay deep within the Shepherd's Way and its secretive practices. The Shepherd's Way community had always been an enigma to the residents of Dry Creek. Pastor Samuel Doyle had moved to the town nearly 20 years ago, establishing the congregation with a small group of devoted followers. Over the years, the group had grown, but its members kept to themselves, rarely interacting with outsiders. Rumors swirled about the strict rules within the community. Women were expected to dress modestly. Technology was forbidden, and any form of disobedience was met with harsh discipline. However, no one ever spoke out against the group publicly. Detective Hartman decided to start his investigation by visiting the church. The large wooden building sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense trees and a tall, wrought iron fence. It felt more like a fortress than a place of worship. Hartman arrived just as the Sunday service was ending. Parishioners filed out, heads down, speaking in hushed tones. Many of them looked surprised to see a police officer on the grounds, but they avoided his gaze as they passed. Inside, Pastor Doyle sat at the front of the church, his back to the door. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and sharp, piercing eyes. When Hartman introduced himself and asked about Luke, Doyle spoke in a calm, measured tone. Luke lost his way, he said, his voice full of righteous conviction. He chose to abandon our teachings, and with that choice he turned his back on the safety of this community. We loved him, but he was no longer one of us. Hartman wasn't convinced. He sensed something darker in Doyle's words, a coldness that didn't match the image of a grieving pastor. Pressing further, Hartman asked about the last time Doyle saw Luke. The pastor hesitated before answering, his eyes narrowing slightly. Luke left us several weeks ago. He was restless, troubled. We prayed for him, but he refused to stay. As Hartman prepared to leave, he noticed several framed photographs hanging on the wall of the church. One in particular caught his eye. It was a photo of Luke with Pastor Doyle and several other members of the congregation. Luke's expression was solemn, almost fearful, and the way the pastor's hand rested on his shoulder seemed more like a grip than a gesture of comfort. Something was wrong in the Shepherd's Way, and Hartman was determined to uncover the truth. Detective Hartman's mind raced as he left the Shepherd's Way church. Pastor Doyle's cold demeanor and the eerie photograph lingered in his thoughts. Luke wasn't just a troubled teen who ran away. Something more sinister had happened within those walls. Hartman decided his next stop would be the Thompson family home. The Thompsons lived in a modest two-story house on the edge of town. They had been part of the Shepherd's Way for over 10 years, ever since they moved to Dry Creek. Luke's parents, Robert and Janet, were devout followers, known for their unwavering loyalty to Pastor Doyle. Hartman knocked on the door, unsure of how they would react to his visit. Janet answered, her eyes swollen from crying. She led Hartman into the living room, where Robert sat on the couch, his face pale and gaunt. "Detective, we've been expecting you," Robert said in a low voice. "We heard the news about Luke. It's been hard to accept." Janet's hands trembled as she spoke. He was such a good boy. But he changed so suddenly. He became distant, angry. Pastor Doyle told us he was struggling with temptation, that he needed to be disciplined to stay on the right path. Hartman's ears perked up at the mention of discipline. "What kind of discipline?" he asked, his tone more serious. Janet hesitated, exchanging a glance with Robert, who shook his head. "There are rules," Robert finally said. "Rules that we all follow in the Shepherd's Way. When someone steps out of line, they face correction. Pastor Doyle believes it's for the good of their soul." Hartman felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard of religious groups using extreme measures to maintain control, but the vague language worried him. What kind of correction did Luke face? He pressed. Janet looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was sent to the retreat house." The retreat house. Hartman had never heard of it, but the way Janet said it made it sound like a place no one wanted to go. He jotted down the name and asked for more information, but the Thompson seemed reluctant to talk further. "We thought it was for his own good," Robert added softly. "We thought it would help him. Bring him back to us." Hartman left the house with more questions than answers. Luke had been sent to the retreat house. But what had happened there? Why had he ended up dead in the hills? Hartman knew he had to find this place and fast. Hartman dug into the town's records and found nothing official about a retreat house. Frustrated, he started asking around, visiting local businesses and quietly inquiring about any property associated with the Shepherd's Way. Most people were tight-lipped, unwilling to say anything that might upset Pastor Doyle or his congregation. Dry Creek, it seemed, lived in fear of the Shepherd's Way. Finally, at a local diner, Hartman got his break. A waitress named Marcy, who'd grown up in the area, mentioned an old farmhouse tucked away in the hills outside of town. "They don't advertise it," she said in a hushed voice, glancing over her shoulder, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "But everyone knows it belongs to them. The Shepherd's Way folks go up there sometimes for special retreats. No one really knows what happens up there, but I heard it's where they send people to repent." Hartman's instincts told him this was the place. Armed with the location, he headed out to the farmhouse the next morning. The drive took him deep into the hills, far from the main roads. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long, winding dirt path, surrounded by thick trees that obscured it from view. The place was old, its windows boarded up, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. There was a heaviness in the air, an unsettling quiet that made Hartman's skin crawl. He parked his car and approached the building cautiously. As he got closer, he noticed something strange: chains and padlocks on the doors. Whoever owned this place didn't want anyone getting in. Or maybe, Hartman thought grimly, they didn't want anyone getting out. Circling the building, Hartman found a window with a loose board. With a swift tug, he managed to pull it off and slipped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows cast eerie shadows on the walls. Inside, the house was sparse and cold, the floors creaking underfoot. As he explored the rooms, Hartman found little furniture, just a few old chairs, a table, and several metal cots in one room. But what caught his attention were the chains. Bolted to the walls near the cots were iron restraints, long enough to keep someone confined, but still able to move slightly. Hartman's stomach turned as he realized what this place was: not a retreat, but a prison, a place of punishment. Detective Hartman stood frozen, staring at the chains bolted to the walls. The faint odor of sweat and fear lingered in the air. This place, the so-called retreat house, was nothing short of a dungeon, a prison disguised as a sanctuary for lost souls. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened to Luke in this wretched building. The bruises on the boy's wrists and ankles now made sense. He had been here, locked up, likely in one of these very restraints. Hartman moved from room to room, searching for anything that could give him answers. In a small back room that resembled a storage closet, he found something disturbing: an old ledger, its pages yellowed with age, tucked behind a stack of boxes. The names of Shepherd's Way members filled the pages, each name followed by dates and strange notations. Hartman flipped through the ledger, stopping when he saw Luke's name written in bold letters. Luke Thompson. May 15th, June 3rd, under correction. Severe discipline required. Hartman's pulse quickened. Severe discipline, whatever that meant, it wasn't good. The dates suggested that Luke had been here for nearly 3 weeks, during which time he had been subjected to some form of brutal punishment. But the most chilling part was what followed. June 3rd, failed repentance. Released. Released. Hartman knew better than to take that word at face value. Luke hadn't been released. He had been discarded, abandoned in the hills to die. His body had been dumped like trash, and the members of the Shepherd's Way had simply moved on, pretending he had left by choice. Hartman pocketed the ledger and took one last look around the house. There were no other signs of recent activity, no footprints or traces of anyone having been there recently. It was clear that whoever had done this was careful, methodical. As he walked back to his car, he made a vow to get to the bottom of what happened here. He wouldn't rest until Luke Thompson had justice. Back in town, Hartman felt the weight of the community's silence. Dry Creek wasn't a large place, and word traveled fast. By the time he arrived at the sheriff's office, whispers were already circulating about his visit to the retreat house. Despite the growing unease, no one was willing to speak up against Pastor Doyle or the Shepherd's Way. Fear hung over the town like a fog, thick and oppressive. Hartman sat in his office, staring at the ledger, contemplating his next move. The evidence was damning, but he needed more than a few cryptic entries in a dusty old book. He needed someone from the inside to come forward, to tell the truth about what had really happened to Luke. His phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. "Detective Hartman, Sheriff's Office," he answered. A hesitant voice came through the line. "Detective, this is Emma." The voice trailed off. "Emma Cartwright. I need to talk to you about Luke." Hartman recognized the name immediately. Emma Cartwright had been one of Luke's closest friends before his sudden estrangement from the community. She had also been a member of the Shepherd's Way, though she hadn't been seen attending services in recent weeks. Her voice was trembling with fear. "I don't feel safe talking here," she continued. "Can we meet somewhere? Somewhere private." Hartman agreed. arranging to meet her at a diner on the outskirts of town. He arrived first, sitting in a booth with a view of the parking lot. When Emma finally arrived, she walked in quickly, keeping her head down. She slid into the booth across from him, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee the waitress brought over. "I can't stay long," she whispered, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected someone to be watching. "If they find out I'm talking to you, I'll be next." Hartman leaned in, lowering his voice. "Emma, I need to know what happened to Luke. I found the retreat house. I know he was there. Tell me what you know." Emma hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "They took him," she said, her voice barely audible. "He didn't want to go, but Pastor Doyle, he said Luke had sinned, that he needed to be cleansed. They locked him up in that house. It's what they do when someone falls out of line. But Luke, he wouldn't break. No matter what they did to him, he refused to repent. He kept saying that what they were doing was wrong." Hartman's heart pounded as she spoke. "What did they do to him?" "Emma." "They hurt him," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "They beat him, starved him, kept him in those chains until he could barely stand. When he still wouldn't repent, they let him go. But they didn't set him free. They left him in the hills, far from town. They knew he wouldn't survive." Hartman clenched his fists under the table, anger boiling in his chest. "Who else was involved?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. Emma hesitated again, then finally said, "It wasn't just Pastor Doyle. There are others. The elders of the church. They follow his orders. They believe everything he says, that what they're doing is God's will. They're the ones who disposed of Luke." Hartman knew this was the break he needed, but it came with a price. Emma's fear wasn't unfounded. The Shepherd's Way had its claws deep in the town, and now she had crossed them. Hartman vowed to protect her, but he also knew that taking down the Shepherd's Way would require more than just a single testimony. He needed to move carefully before the next victim disappeared into those hills. After his meeting with Emma, Hartman felt the full weight of the conspiracy surrounding the Shepherd's Way. It wasn't just a cult led by a delusional pastor. It was a network of devoted followers who believed in the righteousness of their actions, no matter how cruel. He now had the names of a few of the elders, thanks to Emma, but he knew that accusing them without hard evidence would lead to nothing but dead ends and retaliation. Hartman drove to the station, his thoughts racing. He decided to bring his superior, Captain Mills, up to speed. Mills was a straight shooter, a man who'd been in law enforcement for decades and didn't take kindly to anyone exploiting power. If Hartman could convince him of the seriousness of this case, they could begin applying pressure on the Shepherd's Way legally, at least. Captain Mills listened intently as Hartman laid out everything he had learned: the strange behavior of the congregation, the hidden retreat house, the ledger, and Emma's confession about Luke's treatment and eventual death. "Damn," Mills muttered when Hartman finished. "This sounds like it's straight out of a horror movie, and you're telling me they dumped this kid like garbage after torturing him?" Hartman nodded grimly. "Luke didn't die from exposure. He was left out there to make it look that way. We just don't have the autopsy report back yet, but I'm certain it'll show trauma. This was murder, Captain." Mills leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We've always heard rumors about Pastor Doyle, but no one's ever been able to get anything on him. These people are damn near untouchable. If we go in without solid proof, it'll backfire. They've got half the town in their pocket." Hartman expected this response. The cult's grip on Dry Creek was suffocating, and people were terrified of speaking out. "We need a warrant for that retreat house," Hartman insisted. "There's evidence in their chains, restraints. And I've got the ledger that shows Luke was under correction there. If we can get someone else on the inside to flip maybe one of the elders, this whole thing could come crashing down." Mills sighed, finally nodding. "All right, I'll see what I can do. But tread carefully, Mark. These people, they sound like they'll do anything to protect their own." Hartman left the station with a flicker of hope, but as he stepped out into the cool evening air, a strange feeling of being watched settled over him. His instincts told him that Emma wasn't the only one in danger now. That night, Hartman couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. He tried to brush it off as paranoia. After all, he had just confronted one of the most powerful figures in town, and it was bound to make him feel uneasy. Still, as he drove home, he checked his rearview mirror more often than usual. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sensation lingered. When he pulled into the driveway of his modest suburban home, the streets were quiet. He parked, stepped out, and looked around before heading inside. The house was dark, the only light coming from the kitchen, where he had left a lamp on. He lived alone, his wife having left him years ago after his obsession with the job became too much for their marriage to bear. Hartman poured himself a drink and sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages of the ledger again, trying to make sense of the coded notations. As he sipped his whiskey, his mind replayed Emma's words. They let him go, but they didn't set him free. It was becoming clear that Luke had never stood a chance. Just as he was about to close the book for the night, there was a loud crash outside. Hartman shot up, his pulse spiking as he reached for his service pistol. He cautiously approached the front door, his eyes scanning the windows for any signs of movement. The night was still, save for the faint sound of crickets. Opening the door slowly, Hartman stepped onto the porch. He saw it immediately, a small brick, lying in the driveway. His eyes darted toward his car, where the brick had clearly shattered the passenger window, but that wasn't what sent a chill down his spine. Wrapped around the brick was a piece of paper, tied with a rough cord. He crouched down, untied the paper, and unfolded it. In the dim light from his porch, he read the words scrawled in large, bold letters. "Stay out of IT." Hartman's grip tightened on the note, crumpling it in his fist. He scanned the street again, but there was no sign of anyone. Whoever had thrown the brick was long gone. This wasn't just a scare tactic. It was a warning, a threat from someone inside the Shepherd's Way. Hartman's blood boiled. The fear they tried to instill only made him more determined to bring them down. He knew now that he was close to the truth, too close for their comfort. But if they thought they could scare him off, they had severely underestimated him. With a new sense of resolve, Hartman made a decision. He was going to visit Pastor Doyle again this time, not as a detective gathering evidence, but as a man unafraid to confront the evil hiding behind the pastor's mask of righteousness. As he went back inside, locking the door behind him, Hartman knew there was no turning back now. The Shepherd's Way had shown their hand, and it was time for him to push back, harder than ever. Tomorrow, he would return to the church, and he wouldn't leave until the truth, no matter how dark, came to light. The next morning, Detective Hartman woke up with a fire in his gut. The broken window and the threat from the night before didn't shake him, it fueled him. He drove straight to the Shepherd's Way Church, his mind set on confronting Pastor Doyle. Hartman knew it was a risk, but he couldn't sit back while this man used religion as a shield to abuse and kill. The church was quiet when he arrived. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the pews. Hartman pushed open the heavy wooden door and walked down the aisle toward the altar. Pastor Doyle stood at the front, his back to Hartman, seemingly lost in thought as he adjusted the Bible on the podium. Hartman didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk, Pastor," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty sanctuary. Doyle turned slowly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Detective Hartman," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "What brings you here so early? Another question about our faith, perhaps?" Hartman's jaw clenched. "I'm done asking questions, Doyle. I know what you did to Luke. I know about the retreat house and your so-called corrections." Doyle's expression remained calm, though his eyes darkened. "You're mistaken," he said softly, stepping down from the altar. "Luke left us because he lost his way. The Lord has his own plans for the weak." Hartman took a step forward, his eyes locked on Doyle's. "The Lord didn't do this. You did. You beat that boy, starved him, and left him to die in the hills. That's not faith, Pastor, that's murder." Doyle's smile faded. His eyes narrowed as he studied Hartman. "You don't understand, detective. Luke was lost, beyond saving. His soul was poisoned by the outside world. He refused redemption. I did what had to be done to protect the others." Hartman shook his head, disgusted. "You didn't protect anyone. You manipulated those people into believing you're something holy, but you're nothing more than a coward hiding behind Scripture." For the first time, Doyle's calm facade cracked. His voice grew darker, more menacing. "You think you can come in here, into my church, and accuse me of sin? This town is under my care, detective. These people follow me because I give them purpose, something greater than themselves. Luke was a sacrifice for the greater good. His death was necessary." Hartman's stomach twisted with rage. "You don't get to decide who lives or dies, Doyle, and you sure as hell don't get to call it necessary. I've already spoken to someone who's willing to testify against you and the elders. I know about the chains, the beatings, the starvation. It's over." Doyle's face darkened with fury, but before he could speak, the heavy doors of the church creaked open. Several of the Shepherd's Way elders filed in, their faces grim. Hartman recognized them from the photograph he had seen hanging in the church, each of them close to Doyle and fiercely loyal. Doyle's tone turned icy. "You're walking a dangerous path, detective. You're alone here, outnumbered. You think the law will protect you from God's will?" The elders stood behind him, a united front of silent menace. Hartman felt the tension rising in the room. He was alone, but he wasn't afraid. "The law doesn't care about your will, Doyle. I have enough to bring this whole place down, and you know it. If you want to stop me, you'll have to kill me, and that's not going to stop what's coming." For a long moment, the room was silent. The elders watched, waiting for Doyle's command. The pastor took a step back, his hands gripping the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles white. Finally, he smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile. "Get out, detective," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But know this, you won't be able to protect the girl. She'll suffer just like Luke did." Hartman's blood went cold. "Emma." Doyle nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with malice. "She betrayed the flock. We know. And we always punish betrayal." Hartman didn't waste another second. He turned and bolted out of the church, his heart racing. Emma was in danger, and if the Shepherd's Way had already marked her, he had to move fast. Hartman sped through the streets of Dry Creek, his tires screeching as he made sharp turns. His phone was already in his hand, dialing Emma's number. It rang once, twice, no answer. He cursed under his breath, pushing the gas pedal harder. The church's threat had been real, and if they got to her first, she'd be dead before the day was over. He arrived at the Cartwright house, a small, worn-down home at the edge of town. Hartman jumped out of the car, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun as he ran up the front steps. He pounded on the door, shouting her name. "Emma. Emma. It's Detective Hartman. Open the door." No response. Panic surged through him. He kicked the door in, the wood splintering under the force. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the front door creaking back and forth. Hartman moved through the living room, calling her name again. In the back bedroom, he found her. Emma was sitting on the floor, her back against the bed, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She was shaking uncontrollably, her hands wrapped around her knees. Emma Hartman crouched down beside her, gently touching her shoulder. "Are you okay? Did they come here?" She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "They were here, Detective. They left just before you arrived. They told me. They told me I was next." Hartman's heart ached at the terror in her voice. "You're not going anywhere, Emma. I'm taking you into protective custody right now." As he helped her to her feet, Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You have to stop them," she said. "They won't stop, not until they've silenced everyone." Hartman nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will. But first, I'm getting you to safety." With Emma in his car, Hartman drove toward the station. The Shepherd's Way was unraveling, and Pastor Doyle's grip on the town was slipping. But Hartman knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. They had already killed once, and they were prepared to do it again. But this time, Hartman wasn't alone. Emma was the key to bringing down Doyle and his twisted cult, and as long as she stayed alive, the truth would finally come out. The silence that had hung over Dry Creek for too long was about to be broken for good. Hartman didn't waste time. He drove Emma straight to the sheriff's station, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. The streets of Dry Creek seemed emptier than usual, an eerie calm hanging over the town, as if everyone knew something was about to happen. Hartman's instincts told him the Shepherd's Way was already mobilizing. They were powerful and deeply entrenched, and Pastor Doyle wouldn't go down quietly. At the station, Captain Mills met them at the entrance. He took one look at Emma's pale face and gave Hartman a sharp nod. "We'll keep her safe," Mills said, leading them inside. "We've got a safe house up in the hills. No one will find her there." Hartman felt a small measure of relief knowing Emma would be far from the reach of Doyle's followers. But the danger wasn't over, not yet. "I need to get a warrant for Doyle's arrest," Hartman said, his voice hard. "There's enough to charge him with the abuse and murder of Luke Thompson. Emma's testimony should be enough to get us the green light." Mills shook his head, his expression grave. "I spoke to the judge this morning. He's nervous, Mark. You know how tight this town is with the Shepherd's Way. Half the folks on the council are connected to Doyle, but I'll keep pushing." Hartman clenched his fists in frustration. "This is bigger than politics, Mills. They're a cult, and they're killing people. If we don't act fast, Emma won't be the last victim." Mills nodded. "I know. I've already got some deputies keeping an eye on the church, and we'll keep tabs on the elders. But you're right, Doyle's not going to wait around for us to build a case. We'll have to move carefully." Emma sat quietly, her hands still trembling. Hartman knelt down in front of her, meeting her gaze. "You're safe now, Emma. I'm going to stop them, but I need you to stay hidden, no matter what." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't care about me. Just stop them. Stop what they're doing to people like Luke." Hartman squeezed her hand. "I will." Leaving Emma in Mill's care, Hartman left the station, his mind racing. He knew time was running out. Doyle and his followers wouldn't wait long before making their next move, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secret. He needed to find a way to strike first and fast. As he drove back toward the church, he dialed the medical examiner's office. The autopsy report on Luke Thompson had to be ready by now. When the voice on the other end picked up, Hartman cut straight to the point. "Do you have the results on Luke Thompson's autopsy?" There was a pause. Then the examiner spoke. "Yeah, Detective. It's as bad as you thought. Luke didn't die from exposure. He suffered blunt force trauma to the head, likely from being struck with something heavy. He also had multiple broken ribs, severe bruising, and signs of dehydration. Whoever left him in those hills, they intended for him to die slowly." Hartman's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He had known it, but hearing the confirmation sent a surge of rage through him. "Thank you," he said, hanging up. Luke's death had been deliberate, cold-blooded murder disguised as a tragic accident. The Shepherd's Way wasn't just a cult, they were killers. And now, Hartman had proof. Armed with the autopsy report, Hartman headed back to the courthouse, ready to push for a warrant. But as he drove through town, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The streets were too quiet, even for Dry Creek. It was as if the entire town had retreated indoors, leaving Hartman to face the coming storm alone. When he reached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Captain Mills. "Mark, we've got a problem," Mills said, his voice urgent. "Emma's safe, but one of my deputies spotted some of Doyle's men heading up into the hills near the retreat house. Looks like they're planning something. And I don't think they're just there to pray." Hartman's heart sank. He had hoped they wouldn't move this quickly, but he should have known better. The cult was spiraling, and they would do anything to tie up loose ends, including destroying evidence and eliminating anyone who threatened them. "I'm heading there now," Hartman replied. "I'll meet your deputies on site." "Be careful," Mark Mills warned. "These people are desperate." Hartman sped toward the hills, his mind racing. The retreat house had become the epicenter of the Shepherd's Way's cruelty. If Doyle and his followers were gathering there, it could mean they were destroying any trace of what they had done to Luke, and who knew how many others. Worse, they might already be preparing to flee or lash out violently. As he approached the hidden dirt road that led to the retreat house, he spotted a sheriff's patrol car parked near the entrance. 2 deputies stood outside, talking quietly. Hartman pulled up and got out, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice tense. "They've been up there for about an hour," one of the deputies said, pointing up the winding path toward the house. "At least 4 or 5 of them. We think Doyle's inside. No movement yet, but they've been quiet. Too quiet." Hartman nodded. "We're going in. I don't want to wait for them to make the first move." The deputies followed as Hartman led the way up the path, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt and thick forest. The air was still, almost suffocating in its silence. As they approached the retreat house, Hartman noticed something strange, a faint flicker of light coming from the side of the building. A fire. His heart raced. They were burning the evidence. Hartman signaled to the deputies, and they moved closer, weapons drawn. As they rounded the corner of the house, they saw a large bonfire crackling in the clearing behind the building. Several figures stood around it, tossing boxes, papers, and other items into the flames. Among them was Pastor Doyle, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Drop everything and put your hands up," Hartman shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. The figures turned, startled, but none of them moved. Doyle's face twisted into a sneer as he stepped forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Detective," he called out, "how brave of you to join us." Hartman's gun was trained on him. "It's over, Doyle. I've got enough evidence to put you and your whole operation away for good. Step away from the fire." Doyle's smile didn't falter. "Evidence? You think anything in those ashes will save you? You're too late, detective. The truth you're chasing doesn't exist anymore. It's just you and me now." Hartman's jaw clenched. "You're under arrest for the murder of Luke Thompson. I don't make this harder than it has to be." For a moment, Doyle's eyes flashed with something dark and dangerous. Luke's death was a sacrifice, a test of faith. You'll never understand what it means to be truly righteous. Before Hartman could respond, one of Doyle's followers lunged toward him from the side. Hartman reacted instinctively, firing a shot into the air. The man froze, hands raised in panic, and Hartman quickly subdued him with the help of the deputies. Doyle watched, his expression unreadable, as his followers were handcuffed one by one. The fire continued to burn behind him, but it was clear now that no amount of destruction would save him. Hartman stepped forward, grabbing Doyle by the arm. "It's over," he said firmly. As the deputies led Doyle and the others toward the patrol cars, Hartman looked back at the fire. The ashes swirling in the air might have been the last traces of evidence, but the truth was already out. Emma's testimony, Luke's autopsy, and the twisted secrets of the Shepherd's Way would be more than enough to ensure Doyle never saw the light of day again. As the fire burned itself out, Hartman stood in the clearing, watching the flames die. The silence of the hills had finally been broken.